Stanford sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe.
This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people.
Consistent with our values of community and inclusion,
We have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible
the university's relationship to Native peoples.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Matthew Tews, the Associate Vice President for Campus Engagement and the Senior Associate Vice President for the Arts at Stanford University. And I am delighted that you've joined us this afternoon. I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. We're really glad to have you with us. Today, we're thrilled to present a conversation with Catherine Opie and Rebecca Solnit as part of the Komal, Shah, and Gaurav Garg Artists Conversation series, Artists on the Future. Before we begin, let me just say a few words about the series. The framing idea for these conversations is that the arts present a different vantage point for observation, analysis, theorization, and consequently for understanding the world around us. Through the arts, we gain insight into the changing human experience in all its dimensions. Artists can imagine alternative futures and new modes of being and doing. We believe that artists are catalysts that drive cultural change and that art truly has the power to change our world. This series wouldn't be possible without the generosity of Komal, Shah, and Gaurav Garg, and I'd like to invite Komal, an avid art collector, former tech executive, board member at SF MoMA, Stanford alum, and longtime supporter of the arts at Stanford, to introduce Kathy and Rebecca. Before I turn it over to Komal, let me also express my thanks to the team at Stanford Arts and at Stanford Video for their work behind the scenes to make this happen. And now, over to Komal.
And hello, dear friends. We are so excited to share our third season of Artists on the Future with you. Over the past 2 years, we have been so fortunate to convene critical thinkers and artists such as Shirin Nishat, Teresita Fernandez, Njideka Akunyili Crosby, Lorna Simpson, Lynda Benglis, and Dana Schutz, along with Thelma Golden, Sir David Ajay, and Darren Walker. We are truly grateful for their support. Unfortunately, this past year, the ongoing global pandemic and the catastrophic climate disasters have had a significant societal impact. We are witnessing a widening divide, not just in the United States, but around the world. Previously established and collectively shared American values of racial and gender equality now are questioned and threatened. In this time, our resolve to bring activist artists to the fore grows even stronger. We want to hear how their practice informs our awareness of the present and shines a light on what the future might hold. So today, it is a great honor to present the formidable photographer and passionate educator, Catherine Opie. Kathy's work is collected by every major museum in the country, and she is the chair of the art department at UCLA. A careful observer of the American landscape and those who inhabit it, Kathy has been celebrated as the American photographer. Now, while her practice is formally rigorous, Kathy's lens reflects her compassion for her subjects and the humanity that she sees. In conversation with Kathy is the astute writer, historian, and activist, Rebecca Solnit. Rebecca, a product of the California public education system, has authored about 20 books on feminism, Western and indigenous history, and climate change. Rebecca's seminal essay and book of the same name, Men Explain Things to Me, about the patriarchal silencing of women, has struck a chord with many of us and inspired the term mansplaining. I'm sure we're all familiar with it. Additionally, Rebecca is a contributor to The Guardian and sits on the board of Oil Change International. Fun fact, in her formative years, Rebecca worked at SF MoMA and has an affinity for the visual arts. Now, a great thinker once said, despair is easy, or at least low cost. Luckily for us, she also said, to hope is to give yourself to the future. And that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. Well, that thinker happens to be Rebecca Solnit, and we couldn't be more thrilled to understand the present and glimpse the future through her words and Kathy's lenses. Thank you for joining us, and over to you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Komal. Kathy and Rebecca, we are so thrilled to have you with us today. So let's just start with talking a little bit about your past engagement with each other. And maybe Kathy, start with you. Why were you interested in being in conversation with Rebecca?
Well, it has been a 10-year goal, actually. So a decade goal. We met once after the Getty, and I went to a talk that Rebecca gave, and we shared a little breakfast together. And it's one of those things where I'm a little bit of a super fan. So it is because of the profound offerings of her own work that has allowed me also to think very deeply within my own practice as an image maker. And I often read, works, especially, I've read most of all of Rebecca's book, not the most recent one, but I read our writers to understand a little bit better about what I'm trying to do visually in the world. And she is a very important voice to me. And we bring up slide number 1. This was a gift that I actually gave to Rebecca after making it. And it is Blue of Distance. And from her book, Field Guide to Getting Lost, which is a book that I pretty much travel with so I don't get lost. This is my ode to Rebecca, Blue of Distance, which is a continuation all the way through Field Guide to Getting Lost, as these moments and chapters of thinking about the color blue, as well as the relationship to landscape. So this is why this is a dream come true. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining me in this conversation.
My pleasure. It's wonderful to be here. I've just been reading your monograph and looking at it, of course, and just noticing, although there's a lot of ways in which we're profoundly different, also just all the parallels. We're both born in 1961. We're both kind of prolific and voracious and sui generis, and we've made work about some of the same topics. Monuments, landscapes, social movements, the marginalized, etc. I ended up in California through no effort of my own as a kid, and although I was born elsewhere, you moved here. But I think one of the core things is the idea of bearing witness, of really seeing what's out there in the present, and often what isn't being seen, understood, respected, documented, recorded in some way, and trying to amplify the signal. And and that feels like one of the things we have in common a lot. There was a wonderful interview towards the end of the monograph where you said, and it really struck me, I can be critical, but more than anything, I want to be helpful. And I want to be helpful in the times we're living in. And that's something I could have said, because it is always a question that I'm not sure people always ask themselves, like, what does this work do in the world? Who does it help? How does it further the conversation, the transformations, the possibilities? Who does it invite in? Who does it open things up for? And, and we both love Elizabeth Taylor.
No, I have to send you that book now. I had no idea.
Oh, I wrote an essay called Giantess about her role in the movie Giant, where she plays somebody who's, of course, it's a very specific character, but it felt very much like herself, this kind of beautiful woman, but who's also very fierce and comes to liberate people from racism, from sexism, from classism. And she's also just kind of sashaying among these 3 gay men, Rock Hudson, James Dean, and Sal Mineo, in this completely wonderful way, and had been a great support, of course, to Rock Hudson, I think, through his life, and as he died of AIDS and became...
Well, she became an activist.
Yeah, she became kind of the first celebrity AIDS activist, if I'm not mistaken, and really used her, did what you can do with being famous, used that fame as a spotlight to shine on what she believed in and was committed to, which is part of why I love her, along with all the glam.
I mean, there are so many amazing points of connection. And one of them that you both just touched on is the role of geography. And obviously, particularly California, the West, maybe to some extent, even the Bay Area. And I wonder if maybe you can talk a little bit more about how that has played out for your work, but also how you're thinking about place in a society that has become increasingly digital, and what that is looking like for you and in terms of your own work and in terms of our society. Maybe Kathy, just turn to you to start.
I think that one of the most interesting things I think about the digital space is its relationship to activism and bringing people together. The unfortunate part of the digital space also is just the constant spewing of utter lies. And so the relationship of both it being profoundly, potentially optimistic and open as far as gathering together as communities also is highly problematic in terms of where we've gone, especially in relationship to what I feel is the most destructive thing that has ever happened to this country, which is the Trump administration. And landscape within that is like we live in a place, we live on this land, we live on this earth, it's a planet. And so the complicated nature of capitalism as well to land, and that's something that Rebecca writes really beautifully about in A Paradise Built in Hell, is also kind of the relationship of what bearing witness is and trying to connote that through the various bodies of work.
I would say, Stanford, I regret to tell you, Silicon Valley sprung from your very loins. And it's an incredible California technological history going back to Leland Stanford's own building of the Transcontinental Railroad, support for the experimental work of Edward Muybridge that led to the birth of cinema, etc. But Silicon Valley has become a kind of bad faith monster implicated in the genocide in Burma, Myanmar, corrupted elections from Africa to Brexit to Trump's victory, such as it was in 2016. And down to the kind of trauma of teenage girls constantly bombarded with Instagram images of what they're supposed to look like and conform to and be. So I've deeply, I was going to say conflicted, but they're not conflicted. I'm on the internet a lot. I use it. I know I use it for good, I hope. I connect with wonderful people. I do my climate work with it, but I'm really suspicious of it, or because I've seen how damaging it can be, and that the super billionaires controlling it are not acting in the public interest, to say the least. And but also, I just published a book about Edward Muybridge, and one of the things that's really striking in 1984 and other work of his, there's the question of like, what saves us from becoming obedient subjects of authoritarianism, of being swept up in lies and delusions, of being unable to determine what's true and real for ourselves, which he saw, of course, with people in the Third Reich and the Soviet Union and the kind of obedient supporters of Stalin around the world in his day. We see with Trump and the other authoritarians and the people joining QAnon and COVID denial and all the rest. And one of the things he comes back to is the evidence of your own senses. There's a sentence in 1984, but the final commandment of the party was to ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. And so I think the evidence of your eyes and ears of where are you? What do you see out the window? What ground do you stand on? What indigenous people's land, is it? What is its history? But also direct encounters with human beings, everyday activities, making food, holding babies, watching birds and the weather and the rest of it. That there is a kind of, these things are not themselves necessarily inherently political, but I think what Orwell thought, and it helped me understand it and kind of agree with it, is that these things help make the robust, independent human being who can stand up against totalitarianism, who's not so manipulable, who trusts the evidence of their own eyes and ears against what, authoritarians want you to do, which is to believe, that truth, reality, science, history is whatever they say it is and not what any other sources say. So landscape has been just a great joy and pleasure for me. I was a weird alienated kid, and we always talk about love of place, but I feel like places love you back. Growing up in the North Bay, those hills, those trees, those animals, and loved me in a way people were not very good at doing at the time, and understood me in some way. And I still constantly go for a kind of freedom of movement, a kind of visual pleasure, but a grounding that we often use in a very abstract way, but I think is quite literal, with feet on the ground, moving through actual space under an open sky. And, I could go on and on and on because I have, but I think I'll stop there.
Rebecca,
Well-
do you find that, sorry, Matthew, I'm going to actually just have a conversation.
Please do
Rebecca,
it.
do you find that as a source of meditation? Because I think a lot about your trekking, and I think a lot about I know that you traveled with a medical team in Nepal, because I had a good friend on that trip as well.
Oh, who was your friend?
Lindsay Brandt.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, she's one of my
Small world.
closest friends. But I often think like a lot of how I hold landscape photographs are a place for contemplation, like the kind of relationship of stopping and moving and composing, and it becomes this kind of contemplation. And I know that you've written a lot about the West and how the West has been imaged. And it's always interesting to me also in terms of feminism, and that the West was so much photographed in relationship to masculinity and the grandiose nature of it. And so I'm wondering about that kind of relationship of the West, and how you view it as also a place of meditation versus myth building. And what do we do with myth building nowadays?
Oh, that's so many good questions and so much to think about. I'll see what I can do. And I'm kind of restless and almost claustrophobic. So just having open space to move through freely and kind of get back into my body has been important to my well-being in a lot of ways. It's also how I think my book Wanderlust, A History of Walking came out of realizing that walking was so tied to thinking, and it was how I thought through things when I got stuck at my desk and my computer. But that also, it was a lot of other things. Urban walking was gay men cruising, prostitute strolls, uprisings and revolutions, and the claiming of space. And that space is always contested. One of the things that terrifies me about the East Coast and a lot of the intellectuals there, as I felt it as a young woman who'd grown up out of doors a lot, and I was in the last little subdivision before miles and miles of open space between Marin and Sonoma counties, was so a lot of Eastern people seem to think that society was something that you were always completely inside, that you always, sometimes literally people who had no idea that there were places with no grocery stores, and gas stations for 70 miles in any direction, what it's like to be completely alone. As a young woman, I kind of wanted to parachute postmodernists who said it's all alienated signifiers into Alaska to meet grizzly bears.
Right.
And, a grizzly bear may be an alienated signifier, but might also eat you. And, and you have to contend with it in some very real ways. But it also felt, it also felt like a way to be in relationship with the non-human. With the social for me is a kind of horizontal alignment with other beings like you, other human beings. But there's a kind of vertical axis between the kind of earth and sky and the natural world, and kind of beyond the human. Then a reminder constantly that human beings are animals on earth contained within nature. One of the scary and ridiculous things coming out of a bunch of the Silicon Valley guys, notably Elon Musk, is the idea of essentially inhabiting other planets, which is basically ridiculous. It's both ridiculous
billionaire
in all practical terms. and they're having their little rocket trips, which, each rocket trip puts, I think, 1 million times the carbon of an ordinary person into the atmosphere. But it also doesn't recognize, and it treats the earth essentially as disposable. We can fuck it up, we can destroy it because we can move on. And, and it so devalues what it is and what it means. I think the Silicon Valley quest for immortality comes out of that same misunderstanding of biological reality. And that one of the things I think anyone gets from spending a lot of time in the natural world, however they do it, whether it's their backyard or, even medical work, dealing with the leaky, fluid-filled, vulnerable human body, or, wilderness camping or trekking, or, is understanding those biological realities, the grandeur of the earth and also its limits, and the need to somehow align with it, to stop the war on it that sort of industrial civilization has been part of. Since you mentioned those treks in the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau with Roshi Joan Halifax,
Yeah.
one of the things that was so striking is that although the people we met were very sophisticated and often went to Kathmandu for the winters, had cell phones and stuff like that, they're also living in a way that was fundamentally more like how Europeans would have lived 800 years ago than how European descent people live now, plowing with wooden plows pulled by yaks, threshing and winnowing by hand, and really in relationship to all those primordial forces. And there's something, and it wasn't enviable, it was incredibly harsh and difficult and demanding, and but there's also something elemental and connected, kind of unalienated about it. Talking about Orwell yesterday, I was talking about how often we live in a world of alienated stuff. We don't know who made our clothes, who raised and harvested our food, etc. And here were people where the wool they wore came from the sheep they herded, the food they ate, they grew or knew who grew it. Water had a direct relationship to glaciers and snow and weather and bodies of water and stuff like that. And it was profound to be among people like that. And, an incredible gift to me. We were there to bring them some medical access, but they gave us so much more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's sustainability, right? But at the same time, their sustainability is going to be their life is going to completely change as it has, even though they're still living, as you said, like 800 years ago. The problem is when the Himalayas don't have the snow, and like as our climate continues to warm, their way of life is going to be completely compromised, even though they've kept the light footprint, so to speak, in terms of sustainability all of these years. And I find that I just find that heartbreaking,
No, climate change is a crime committed by the wealthy against the poor. The global north against the south is, horrific to contemplate, particularly these people who have such a deep and intimate relationship going back so many centuries. And, why I'm a climate activist. I'm on a board and 2 advisory boards and starting a new climate project and donating and fundraising and protesting and trying to amplify the signal.
Yeah.
And, I'm not writing a new book right now, partly because I needed a break after doing essentially a book a year for more than 20 years, and partly to be a better climate activist.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, and kind of the relationship between your work, your writing, Kathy, your photography, your artistic work, and the ability to make an impact. And I wonder if you're thinking about that impact of your work differently now, in part because of COVID, in part because of the way the world is moving. Rebecca, you've mentioned kind of moving into a different mode right for the moment in terms of your work. Kathy, are you thinking about the impact of your work differently at this point, or how are you thinking about it in terms of its ability to make some change in these big issues?
I mean, I would say that my work is still a critique of power within our culture. And I mean, I went to Rome recently, and that'll be the next body of work I edit after 2020, where I traveled the country in an RV looking at monuments that were removed and monuments that remain. Now I'm going to look at, I'm kind of, I guess I'll just say it, I'm taking on the Catholic Church. Why not? So the body of work that I made at the Vatican is called Walls, Windows, and Blood. So I photographed all the existing exterior walls of the Vatican panoramically, black and white. So instead of panoramically, they're actually vertical panoramas. And then I photographed out of every single window inside the Vatican looking out onto Rome. And then I photographed every a representation of spilt blood within the artwork of the Vatican. So using constantly, and even with the monument body of work, let's bring up slide number 1 for real now, monumental. A lot of the work these days is in relationship to the structure of language, as well as, going back to what Rebecca said in terms of bearing witness. So this is my poem to 2020. It's a suite of 7 photographs. All the landscapes are abstract, so no, nothing is wrong with your camera at home. The only one that's in focus is the Robert E. Lee Monument from Richmond, Virginia. That has now been removed since September of 2021. I was there in September of 2020 when it was truly an activist site. So with land, and it's kind of what Rebecca's talking about in terms of like climate change is going to be the next greatest fight for us in terms of humanity, because we will become a species that becomes extinct. And I kind of think that that's where we're going. Quite honestly, I don't see another way out of it. And so you'll notice that the bookends, like the sun is setting in both, but exact same position of the sun setting. It's just the changing of the camera. So can I use images more metaphorically these days in relationship to the idea of what is nature? Whose land is this? Water being the most important symbol for us all in terms of water deprivation and what water is going to mean, especially here in the West. I got obsessed during the pandemic with Beaver Island in Michigan, thinking, oh, I just need to move to Beaver Island. I'll be surrounded by water. There's not large agriculture that'll make the algae blooms. And I'll just go back to the Midwest because I grew up on Lake Erie, but I don't want to go back to Lake Erie. It has its own problems. So I kind of grew, with Rebecca and I both saying that we're from 1961, I think that is really important in thinking of those years in relationship to the movements that we watched and we were involved in through our lives. And being both 60, it's really fascinating going from, the bad advertisement of the crying Native American canoeing through the trash to where we still have denied it all of these years. And so I kind of hope that the work keeps pushing up against the relationship to both capitalism and power and the extent of really big lies. And, especially in relationship to the Catholic Church and the harm that they have literally done in relationship to so-called humanity is really problematic for me.
And both of you are working on monuments specifically, and that really relates to all of these themes. And Rebecca, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about where you're going on that.
I do. I find it completely fascinating that in this country, from Maryland to California and all through the country, people are taking down monuments, often with a huge amount of conflict. The horrific Charlottesville white supremacist riot in 2017 was protesting taking down that Robert E. Lee statue, which is now down and going to be melted, and I think used to cast an anti-racist work of art. And I love that the city got behind some serious recycling there. But normally when you see a lot of monuments changing, places being renamed, which is also happening, Deb Haaland is having the word squaw, which is derogatory, taken off federal places. Here in San Francisco, we took an anti-Chinese name, James Phelan's name, off a street, and it's now Frida Kahlo Way. This renaming and re-commemorating normally happens with regime change, and it is marking, I think, something as profound as regime change. People tend to imagine revolution as toppling regimes through violence or political means. But the kind of revolution that's been happening since Kathy and I were born has been largely cultural revolution, rethinking race, gender, sexuality, the relationship to the natural world, for economics, human nature itself, and Confederate monuments, pioneer monuments, racist monuments, because Black Lives Matter in the George Floyd protests resulted in a lot of Christopher Columbus statues coming down. A number of places, I think it started in Colorado and Berkeley, no longer celebrate Columbus Day. And so one of the things I've really devoted myself to for the past 20 years nearly is documenting how these incremental changes add up, that the grounds for hope is both remembering the past in which we do have victories and understanding the nature of change, which isn't the kind of instant results guaranteed or your money back that a lot of people want and think nothing has happened if that's not what it looks like. And so, taking down a Confederate monument doesn't mean that racism is over.
Yeah.
But we really create the space in which we imagine ourselves and our possibilities or our limits through this public stuff. When I did my New York City Atlas, I created a map called City of Women with Emma Watkins and another collaborator. We're releasing City of Women London, which does the same thing, renames all the stops on the subway map after women who've been important to that city. But the shock for me of doing City of Women New York was realizing I have spent my whole life in places named almost exclusively after men. And usually white men, powerful, military, wealthy. Stanford University, not named after it's named after the sun, but the big four railroad barons, Stanford, Crocker, etc., have lots of things named after them. San Francisco, named after St. Francis, one of the better guys. California's actually named after Califia, a black female fictional figure. So we have a little bit of divergence there. But New York, but almost every place is. And I realized, what would it be like to live in a world where things were as likely to be named after women as men? And I asked some Columbia students that, and a woman said, on a boulevard named after a great woman, I don't think a man would dare to sexually harass me. And another woman said, I have slumped all my life. I would stand up straight on a street named after someone like me. She's a woman of color. And so I think these things can be treated as decorative or merely symbolic, but we're thinking animals. We live in worlds made out of symbols, and changing symbols has real impact. And, and we have to change these things. It's often like, oh, we should name a school after Rosa Parks for little black girls. And it's like, yeah, but also for little white boys.
For little white boys, exactly.
Superheroes are not all going to be people like them that they can admire and support and learn from other kinds of heroes and other forms of heroism than, the dude at the head of the army. They just took down Theodore Roosevelt in front of the Natural History Museum in New York, and I was arguing the horse did nothing wrong. I wish we could just leave the horses up.
Leave the horses, I know.
It's very hard to divorce a bronze horse from its rider, though, I believe.
Yeah.
And now I have truly and genuinely digressed, which is what I do all the time.
Kathy, do you want to share your reflections on monuments as well?
Yeah, let's go to slide number 2. I think that this is, and then I'll show a work out of 2020. It was because of the first social media photographs of the Robert E. Lee in Virginia that becoming an activist site that I decided to do this road trip after taking part of Black Lives Matter marches here in Los Angeles, not marches, protests. And so I started thinking, well, here we are in the middle of a pandemic. What is my role in being able to actually bear witness and the importance of it, that it goes beyond a journalistic voice as well? And so I started making these diptychs. They were going to be single images. And I realized that the time that we live in actually needs to create the notion of the dialogue, that a single image no longer can hold as the placeholder of the complicated nature of both living in a pandemic and really a new reckoning within the American landscape. And so here we have a woman who came out for a cigarette break who's showing me the monument in North Carolina, which is in Oxford, North Carolina. And then I happened to place it on top of the Stonewall Jackson monument from Monument Boulevard in Richmond, Virginia. And so these ideas of what is removed, what is remained, that visually this ends up, going on top of that plinth, but yet it's been completely removed, is all really important in terms of the language of how we incorporate space. And the fact that this specific place in Richmond became an activist site was so utterly important for that city in coming to their own reckoning, so to speak. So without activism in a certain way in relationship to this and these kind of arguments and discussions around this, I had a very interesting discussion last night at the Broad with Christopher Hawthorne about monuments, who's also on the planning committee of Los Angeles. And, these spaces do need to be reconfigured. And I'm actually not that interested in monuments. I'm actually more interested in memorials. And that's what I said last night, that when you go to the Peace and Justice Memorial and you look at these different ways of beginning to inhabit space from a place of also loss, in which it's not a celebration of war. I'm kind of tired of the celebration of war in relationship to American culture. I'm done with the $17 trillion that was spent in Afghanistan, but we can't get a package through in terms of voting in the Senate. Are you kidding me? So, I will continue to be a political person in relationship to making work because it's just too important not to participate in.
Thank you. And the impact of both of your work has obviously been hugely profound in all the ways that you're describing. We've been talking about its impact in society, and I think one of the interesting aspects of the work that both of you do is that your work also has a deep grounding in artistic history of various kinds, and so it draws that through line from the past through the present to the future. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what some of those artistic references have meant to you as you're thinking about the kind of impact that you could have in our broader society. And maybe Rebecca, we'll just start with you.
Yeah, I feel incredibly lucky that I came up through the visual arts. And I lost my job as a waitress just as I began graduate school in the School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. I was always a pretty incompetent waitress and could not open a bottle of wine respectably. So I went to the work study department and ended up with a research job that suited me so much more at SF MoMA, working on the permanent collection catalog of masterworks for the museum's 50th anniversary. Sweetly, my 2010 atlas was part of the museum's 75th anniversary, and I'd like to tell them I'm available for the 100th, which is now only 13 years away. And but artists really taught me to think and encouraged me to think of myself not just as the journalist and the art critic I'd been. I got a job at a little art magazine, embarrassingly, Art Week, but which taught me a lot about West Coast and contemporary art, a lot about writing and editing, and just gave me a lot of hands-on experience cranking out copy to, on announcements and things like that. But a lot of the people I was around were artists, and artists, much more than literary people these days, tend to ask truly foundational questions. What is the medium? What are the materials? Who is the audience? As Walter Benjamin once said, not what does the work say about the means of production, but what is its position in the, in relationship to the means of production. And, these deep ontological and ethical questions. I worked with Richard Misrak and Ann Hamilton, Louis DeSoto, and Lynda Connor, a number of other artists, and really learned from them. And a lot of them were landscape oriented, and I learned that. But just this process of questions that go all the way down to the fundamentals in the beginning. What making is, who the audiences will be. It was so formative for me, and I'm so grateful that it happened that way, because I think it would have been so much more. I don't think this is a word, but it should be conventionalizing to, the other avenues, the more obvious avenues. And I still work with artists. I work with, regularly. Megan Ripenoff and Mark Klett are two of the
Mark, yeah.
Yeah, and both kind of nature and landscape related. And of course, Byron Wolf and Mark and I on an ongoing project about Lake Powell, Glen Canyon, and climate change. So that was really formative in asking bigger questions. Of course, lots of postmodern theory was swimming around in the 80s. I feel like the 80s, and this is part of Kathy and me being the same age, or Catherine, I should say, was a completely overlooked decade. People never shut up about the 60s, which are wildly distorted in what they were anyway. And the 80s was despite Reagan, was an incredibly radical decade for feminism, queer representation and power and rights, and kind of rethinking the left and political organizing to something that was more kind, nonviolent, and inclusive, a huge anti-nuclear movement, and so much more. And so it was a really interesting formative time in broad ways as well. And the postmodernism for me kind of did what the visual art did, which was just to teach the possibility of asking really foundational questions, really essential questions, to assume nothing and question everything.
Mm-hmm. No, that's interesting. I mean, I would have to say that one of the criticality of the 80s was fascinating, because it actually really was questioning the notion of representation as well, right? And so, I mean, that was one of the best things in a certain way that began to happen also in terms of me thinking, what is documentary photography? Because the impetus of being a documentary photographer, and I will use that title for myself at times. I mean, I think that I play with the notion of documentation and what that is, but it did come out of 9 years old reading my social study book about child laborers. And I was supposed to write a report about that, but instead all I did was describe the Lewis Hine photograph of the little girl working in the South Carolina mill. And so there is this kind of really interesting idea of what a photograph is. Is a photograph a stand-in? Is it a moment? Is it bearing witness? Does it allow you to transform the relationship of both architecture and the body? What's the way that those things begin to come together? And I would say that is like the life's work, is not only in relationship to being an activist in terms of a queer community and documenting that, but what is the extent of trying to get to a larger place of humanity, and somehow can work lead us there. And I think that you and I are both highly optimistic people with a good sense of criticality and questioning as well. But I think that in the end, I really, really hope that the work reaches a greater understanding of the incredible conflicted nature of what it is to be human.
Kathy, you're teaching the next generation of artists now, and you're chairing the art department at UCLA. Yeah. How do you think about that pedagogical approach, given what you just said?
Well, I think art can be so many different things, and that's one of the things. Is my own position of being an artist is not the position that I necessarily need my students to take. I don't mind like talking from the point of view that I think about things, but I also have to make sure that I'm looking at each individual in relationship to their own questions that they're trying to answer with their practice. And so I have no kind of ego in relationship to like, yeah, study with me because I'll make you, think like me. I really like, I kind of hate teaching in that way, but I do think that I can facilitate their bigger questions of what it means. And they have huge questions, this generation. And I'm having a very hard time actually trying to hold this moment for these young people. I have a 19-year-old son myself, and it is an enormous responsibility to mentor this generation. And I think that I'm doing it more practically. I mean, maybe, practicality with a little dash of being an intellectual is like, okay, you guys, let's teach you financial literacy. Let's get that going. How does an artist actually do this? Like, let's get some practical things. I don't believe in tuition free, but I believe in debt free. How do I move my program towards that? How do we allow them to go into internships all throughout the city so that they can decide what are the possibilities of job avenues? So a lot of my chairing happens to be very practical ideas of how to move them forward versus a pedagogical position of arts and education.
Rebecca, do you have practical or other suggestions for how we can move forward, even if not chairing a department? Suggestions for how we build a future together?
I would just go back to something that came up earlier and say that this is the decisive decade on climate, and it is, we're not going to make climate change go away, but the difference between the best case scenario, if we do what the scientists tell us we need to do, and the worst case scenario is profound for, most life on Earth, in the next decade, but also in the next, 10,000 years. So, but I also just, I feel so much for the young now. It was so much easier. My parents cut me off when I was 17 and I put myself through college and stuff. And I am the baby boomer here to say it was so much easier when I was young. I have seen Reaganomics and its successors recreate a landscape of incredible economic inequality, impoverishment, debt peonage, and unfairness, and the young are getting the brunt of it and they know it. And so I see them oppressed in those ways, but I also find incredible hope in that so many of them are so smart and generous and creative in their thinking about gender and sexual orientation, or the rejection of all conventional frameworks for it, in their embracing of kindness as an ethic for how we should treat each other, in their anti-capitalism, in their commitments and their hopes and things like that. So through the climate movement, I get, also through my friends' kids and family and stuff, but particularly through the climate movement, I get to meet a lot of young and idealistic people. And they do give me hope. And I feel like we have to struggle to create the circumstances that won't crush them, and then hand it over to them, and they'll do a great job. And, of course, a lot of them are already taking the reins, to use a horsey metaphor. But, but I do see, and I did teach 3 spring quarters at Stanford in 2017, 18, and 19, and loved working with the students then, and found them just brilliant and wonderful to be around, and asking questions that really helped me think. But so that's how I see the young and our responsibility towards them. In some sense, they're people we can learn from and that are exemplary. In other senses, they're people who are tremendously oppressed by the economic realities of the present and the ecological disasters that are looming. And we are obliged to do everything we can about both of those. And those two things, as well as the process of securing voting rights for everybody,
Yes.
Are all intertwined. If everyone in this country equally had access to the ballot, we will vote in overall a bunch of really great progressive anti-racist pro-environmental human rights candidates who will do quite a good job. The American right essentially has acknowledged that it will never be a majority party, so it can only succeed through minority rule, and will get there through voter suppression and election corruption. And that used to be kind of subtle and nuanced and well disguised, and now it's naked and obscene and out in the open, and but at least out in the open where we can fight it directly.
Yeah, and out in the open, and our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has an enormous amount to do with kind of rewriting the relationship of voting as well in terms of the Federalist Society. I mean, the damage that that has done is phenomenal. And
I believe if they hadn't killed the Voting Rights Act in 2013 in the Supreme Court, Trump wouldn't have won his corrosive, corrupted minority electoral college victory in 2016. In, I think it's Wisconsin alone, Ari Berman of Mother Jones demonstrated 200,000 Black people were prevented from voting, and that's a state he won by like a 12,000 vote margin. So you put those 200,000 Black people back in equal access, and you see what happens.
And do you see a role for artists in that conversation as we look at those judicial and other realities?
I mean, the role of the artist is depending on what they individually want to take on, and I'm very much about that. But as I said, I'm not prescribing everybody to be an activist in relationship to how I approach the world or think about it. But I certainly hope that my ideas and my role as an artist influence is a generation of thinkers in relationship to what they're putting out as cultural capital, so to speak.
I would just add that, coming up in the 80s, there was also a lot of what I called political flavored art that didn't actually kind of represented its own radicalness in a very blue chip way without real impact. And you had people who made abstract paintings but went to, labor meetings. You had people that all of us are citizens, by which I don't mean we have US citizenship and passports. All of us are members of society, and we all have some responsibility. But you have people who make completely beautiful unrelated things and then donate or poll monitor or things like that. It doesn't have to be through the art. And sometimes saying that it is becomes a way to not engage in other ways. And sometimes, as with Kathy's work, through the art a great deal can happen that matters a lot. But there's no one size fits all for how to be, a responsible member of civil society.
Yeah.
I just try and wear all the hats at once.
Rebecca, I have a curious question for you.
I'm here.
I know that, you do a lot of trekking, you do a lot of bearing witness as well, that the majority of your work is writing, but I have to ask you a question. When you go to these places, do you take pictures?
Oh God, yeah. And I'm so happy that digital cameras and then iPhones came in and you can take, endless pictures, and some of them come out nicely, but I think of them as a kind of note taking. And when I write about places and I often go back to them as a point of reference.
Okay.
Today is the 72nd anniversary of George Orwell's death, and I posted a picture I took at his grave in September of 2019 on my last big trip. So yeah, no, I do. And when I was in my 20s, and as a kid, I wrote and drew equally, or with equal enthusiasm, if not with equal ability. And in my 20s, I spent some time in the darkroom with a 35 millimeter camera and stuff. And being around really great photographers convinced me, first of all, that I didn't have the precision in my nature. And second of all, that I was only going to be able to devote myself wholeheartedly to one thing, and it was going to be writing. But I've learned a lot from them. And even when I'm out with Mark and Byron and they're making pictures that will go to museums, I'm photographing them and what we're seeing. these days with my iPhone and using it for the writing that will be part of the work we do together. And I've been spending a lot of time at Ocean Beach in San Francisco, fascinated with sand patterns and, of
Oh,
course,
yeah.
inevitably taking sunset pictures and things. Photographed my beautiful great nieces, political protests at, roses and all sorts of other things. So yeah, no, digital photography has made it really easy, and you don't feel like you're using anything up when you're just committing more pixels to more files. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I take photographs quite regularly, and
That's
I
good.
love it.
I was curious about that because you are such a, prolific writer in terms of being able to also describe space in such an interesting way that I thought, oh, I wonder if also there is any moment in time that you're looking at your own photography archive.
Oh yeah, they're super helpful, and it's also interesting because I think I turn everything into words, and words are always somewhat distorted descriptions. I remember actually with a Lynda Connor photograph realizing that I must have described it to myself and then remember the description. And when I looked at the original, it was quite different in sort of composition, scale, etc., even though it had the same ingredients.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it becomes kind of a fact checking too sometimes. And then it becomes easy sometimes to just photograph, um, wall text signs, and actually
Yeah.
these days you can go to an archive as before the pandemic. I did regularly as research and just photograph the materials instead of having it photocopied or scanned or something.
Yeah.
And that's, I have my iPhoto library is full of hundreds of pictures of pages of books and things that might be useful to somebody trying to figure out what the hell I was doing, but are certainly not giving anybody any visual pleasure.
Yeah. So can I ask one more question,
Oh,
Matthew?
yeah.
Please
Sorry.
do it.
As you know, like you're one of my cultural heroes, heroines, and as well as Didion and another handful of others. Who are yours?
Well, kind of my holy trinity early on for being a writer would be Virginia Woolf, Henry David Thoreau, and George Orwell. And even before that, Jorge Luis Borges was a huge influence. James Baldwin
Mhm.
came after, and then actually the Zapatistas and Subcomandante Marcos generated a much more poetic and grounded and lyrical political language that also had a huge influence on me, along with a lot of Latin American writers like Eduardo Galeano. And but also, it comes from everywhere, from seeing
Right.
people like Greta Thunberg stand up and bear witness,
Mhm.
Black Lives Matter. Actually, Adrienne Marie Brown is a huge hero of mine nowadays for being an utterly radical Black woman, but who's also deeply committed to pleasure, kindness, and and a kind of criticality that never shades over into meanness and
Mhm.
stuff. And then
Yeah.
there's so many more. But those first three I named really, as I realized that being a writer was going to mean being a nonfiction writer, I feel like more than anyone taught me kind of what an essay could be and how to write, and that you could be deeply lyrical and deeply political. And in the US, I think, particularly less in, not so much in visual art, but writing is often very segregated.
Mhm.
Here's aesthetic writing, here's political writing, that they often get very separated. So anybody who lets us have those things together, as Baldwin does, and as Orwell does, as Woolf does, in a particularly beautiful way, because she's so passionately brilliant about the subjective and also such a great social critic. So any of them
Mhm.
almost gives permission. And so a lot of times it's writers who I feel like I don't want to do exactly what they're doing, but they've given me permission to do what I need to do.
Right. Yeah, I
And
understand that.
it can be somebody who's really quite different a lot of the time. And
Yeah.
Michael Ondaatje made me think, well, what does writing silence look like, for example?
Mhm.
Isaac Denison's fables set in Denmark
Mm.
gave me a sense of kind of the fairy tale as a way of telling.
Yeah.
the discussion of heroes is maybe a great segue
Yeah, I was going to
into,
ask Kathy hers.
yeah, first we need to hear from Kathy, and then maybe segue to a couple of questions from the audience that were submitted in advance just to close out our discussion today. So Kathy, heroes.
I mean, heroes in photography are vast and in art, but I would say that I spend an enormous amount of time both in the nonfiction and fiction world. Fiction for me, I mean, anybody from Dorothy Allison in terms of how she writes about trauma, to Octavia Butler in relationship to gender, and I'm very interested in sci-fi. Kim Stanley Robinson is one of my favorite writers that I've read all the way through, and really interested in the way that he talks specifically about climate change and the recent books that he's been writing. Sontag, Didion, these women who I feel that are utterly feminist and bold in relationship to their ability to place the woman in a position of power, which is rare in terms of other theoretical writing. But I would say that I'm a very voracious fiction reader, and less so now theoretical, but I still go there when I need to do some thinking. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you both. Let's just shift gears to a couple of questions to close out that have been submitted in advance by the audience, and maybe start in a kind of somewhat similar vein. Any stories that you could tell about a challenge you faced on your path to be an artist, and what made you stick with it, whether it was heroes or something else? Maybe Kathy, just turn to you.
Perseverance is very important in one's practice. There's going to be a lot of different things within your field that will, be obstacles. But what are really obstacles if you're a thinking person? And generosity has to come first, and generosity is part of being a productive citizen within society. And I kind of believe those a little bit archaic qualities. I actually believe in citizenship and doing the right thing as a human being. And so, but yeah, there's obstacles along the way, absolutely. But life isn't that interesting if there's not challenges. It's how you kind of move and navigate through that is far more interesting in my mind.
Rebecca.
Oh, I wrote in my memoir recollections of my non-existence about some of them. As a really young woman, people just didn't think I should have a voice. And, so much gender violence, et cetera, relies on a society in which women won't be heard, will be punished for speaking up, won't be believed, will be shamed or mocked or whatever. And even as a young writer, I had a lot of very unpleasant experiences in the publishing world with men sabotaging my manuscripts or the promotion of my book and things like that. And, one person at a publishing house going rogue and nobody else believing me and stuff. And it would be very odd where it's like, you're publishing my book of history, but you won't believe me that this guy is doing this thing. Mm-hmm. And my second book, the publicist told me I was booked into bookstores across the American West. It turned out he'd never made the phone calls. He sent me off on a book tour in my pickup truck. All the gigs we'd booked ourselves. My brother was working with me on this anti-nuclear indigenous rights book. Were real. All the things he said he'd booked us for were fictional. And, and I'd been saying all along that that something was wrong, and everybody was like, oh, young women are so overwrought and emotional. And
right, exactly.
Just that, and the broader cultural thing. My essay, Men Explain Things to Me, comes from a man whose response to me saying I wrote a book about Muybridge was not to ask me about the book, but to tell me about the book I should read, which turned out, because he wasn't listening, to be the book that I'd written. So I feel like I've been lucky overall, and I did have men and women and other people who were also really supportive of the work. But misogyny itself was an obstacle. I'm tenacious, and there wasn't anything else I'd rather do, so I stuck with it. But it was and is an obstacle, as racism is, as homophobia and transphobia are, for people trying to have a voice. And I feel like, and this is something Kathy and I have in common, is that the one of the things you use a voice for is to make room for other voices, to amplify those voices, to defend them, to hear them, and things like that. And so I feel like that's become a central thing that I've tried to do in my work, from that second book where I was writing about the Western Shoshone land struggle to the work I do in the present.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a great segue to a final question, which is a good one to end on, I hope. What do you think offers the most hope for an equitable and sustainable future? And Rebecca, anything that offers?
Yeah, and I think if you add up all the subtle, nuanced, complex, incremental things going on, you see that the world that Kathy and I were born into, we're the same age as the Berlin Wall, a kind of pièce de résistance of the Cold War. You see that the world has transformed so profoundly that you don't have to have faith that change happens. You just have to see the reality of it happening really with dizzying speed when you see how really big concepts like marriage have been radically changed, in the last 30 years. And, we were born into a world in which to be queer was to be treated as either mentally ill or criminal or both. A world that before, we're a year older than Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, in which there was not even any language to think about the environment meaningfully, no great public language. A world in which so many kinds of racism and discrimination against the disabled and as well as other categories was the norm. And, and so seeing how much has changed, we can't see the future. The future is the night we're plunging into, but we can look back in the daylight of the past, as Kathy does so beautifully with the monuments and so much other work, and see what is changing. It was so interesting looking at her work, for example, her famous piece from the mid-90s with the house and the couple carved.
Yeah, the two six-figure girls, yeah.
And see how differently that feels now than then. Not that like being a queer family is, and getting home loans is, for same is all taken care of and there are no problems. But it is a really different world than that world of, is it 27, 29 years? Was that 90?
Yeah, 1993. I made that.
29
Yeah.
years ago. You
Yeah,
got a
almost 30
30th
years
birthday
ago.
for that picture next year.
I know, a 30th birthday picture.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So that's what so that's what makes me hopeful, and seeing that despite the fact that the news has to be about everything that's going wrong, all the damage that's being done, seeing a kind of new spirit of generosity, equality, anti-authoritarianism, kindness, and really, worldwide, and ideas like feminism that are now present almost everywhere and that will never be erased no matter how hard they try. And and just the heroic people, whether it's on human rights in Burma, dissident voices in Iran, or, rights for refugees in this country, just seeing the billions of people with those commitments really moves me and keeps me hopeful.
Kathy, anything to add? Anything that keeps you hopeful?
I mean, that was so beautiful. I think collectivity keeps me hopeful. The relationship of being able to actually continue discourses and meeting in places such as this, even though it has its own fraught history. But we, as Rebecca says, we can't really see the future, but we can always move forward in a more equitable relationship to what the future can hold, and try to literally continue to still create the pathways for a positioning, not only myself as a thinker, but that collectivity of that energy I do believe in. I really believe that the spirit of humanity is incredibly strong. And that's where the optimism just hopefully continues. But that doesn't mean that we ever sit down and not pay attention. It's really, really important to pay attention.
That's a great place to close. So let's end there. Kathy, Rebecca, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. Really appreciate this conversation, and appreciate all of you for joining and for spending time with us as well. Thanks very much. Good
Can
night.
I'm going to add one more thing, and that's Komal. Thank you for such a beautiful introduction. And thank you for supporting this series. It's really an incredible gift. And I just can't wait to break bread with you one day. So thank you so much for that.
I would love that. Today morning has been so special. It's my birthday today.
Oh, happy
I
birthday.
could not imagine a better birthday present
Oh,
than
that's
this
excellent.
conversation. It's been joyful, optimistic, but still very true to the present. And hearing all three of you discuss has been just magical for me. So thank you.
Well, have a great birthday, and thank you for everything that you do. It's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. What a joy.